Just as a show of hands, how many people have actually printed something on a 3D printer? You can all leave. Cool, that's very good. It's very good. This presentation is really geared to an engineer who is sort of starting on the journey of a 3D printer. Many of us think that when you buy a printer, you bought a product, but you really haven't. You've embarked on a pretty wild journey. And this presentation is sort of to make you aware of all the different steps that go into the workflow that goes from having a virtual model sitting as a CAD model and making that be a real physical part in your hands and all at the desktop. So I'm not going to get into all the various metal technologies and the high-end printers, but I'm really going to kind of stay at that very basic desktop engineering product line. Good with that? Okay. 3D printing is it's real. It's real. It's viable as a product and as a service. It's innovative. It allows you to make parts and geometries that you really can't do in a traditional manufacturing process. And it's complex. It is not plug and play. There's a lot more to it than pushing that easy button and watching a part pop out that looks just like the part that you designed in CAD. My name is Dennis, and I've kind of been in the career, or had my career be involved in CAD and CAM and PLM pretty much all the time. I started off as an NC programmer out of college, and kind of got into. I worked with Unigraphics for a lot of years. Had my own company for a while. My company was involved in training engineers to use CAD/CAM systems, and we did that through online training. We were pretty early in the game. The company was called CAD Train. We were acquired by PTC a few years ago, and then I kind of started to look around for the next thing, and I felt very enamored with 3D printing. I got into it. It's been around for 25 years. I got into it a couple years ago, and I really, really fell in love with the fact that you could actually make something and sit in your chair and hold it in your hand. You know, very, very different from doing CAD modeling my whole life. I also felt like I'd kind of done a career turnaround because I was back to being an NC programmer. As an NC programmer, in those days, I got a stack of blueprints, and I'd have a quad pad, and I was a manufacturing engineer by training, and I would take these drawings and in my mind imagine them on the quad pad and rotate it around and figure out the raw stock would look like, and I'd write an app program, and I'd crank out some CL files and G codes, and I'd walk over to the machine shop, and I'd sit there and I'd watch these parts being made and go through first article QA. And it was very tangible and very rewarding to actually see the physical product from what you had played with in your mind. And I feel now, like with 3D printing, I'm kind of back in that world again. I can actually do something that's engineering oriented, that's precise, that's accurate, and through several iterations, I now have the part in hand again. And I just find that to be a real satisfying process. And I'd like to share what I've learned in making this thing work. I started off thinking that it was easy. I decided that it needed a little more help. So, myth versus reality. The formal marketing term for 3D printing these days is a gold rush. It's so hyped, and there's so much news coming out that it's hard to remember that this technology's been around for 25, 30 years. There's daily press releases regarding new applications, and fortunes will be made. The new Facebooks of the world will come from this industry. We just don't quite know what it looks like yet, but this is the direction this industry is going. There's new entries from HP, Microsoft. There's an announcement from Staples and United Parcel Service. But the challenge is to separate the myth from the reality. First of all, is 3D printing fast? Well, the kind of a gauge of that is you have about an hour of time for every inch of Z, of vertical, that you print. So if you have a part that's 8 inches or something like that, ballpark 8 hours on the printer. So is that slow or is that fast? Well, when you sit there and watch this thing go, 1 inch an hour, it's forever. But the alternative is to, maybe I had to go out and I had to build some tooling and I had to, do this and do that to get the part. And I might be 4 weeks between the time that I had made my model and got my part. In that case, that's really fast because I can get it in 8 hours. So, tad relative, but so perhaps a myth, perhaps a reality. Cheap, yeah. I think for the desktop applications, 3D printing is cheap. You can get machines for less than $1,000, but they're kind of hobbyist machines, and they're rep wraps and they're kind of open source. When you get to that $5,000 price point, that's the magic price point for the 3D printer manufacturers, and they look at that, and machines are getting pretty good. The machine that's upstairs, the FDM machine with the 2 spools, that's about $5,000. That's a pretty powerful machine. The one next to it, the SLA machine, that's about $10,000. So that's kind of getting out of the realm of that desktop price point that we're trying to reach. But I think that you can get a good, reliable prosumer grade machine for about $5,000. And I think you can afford to put one of those in every engineering office. Easy? That's a myth. This is not easy. There's no such thing as pushing a button and getting the part to come out. The very first, and the vendors kind of don't know how to deal with that, because on one end, the people that make the vendors that sell CAD systems look at the model and say, well, I got your beautiful clean model. All you got to do is crank out an STL file, and the 3D printer guys say, well, just give me an STL file, and print will turn out a beautiful part. What's missing is all the steps in between. That part has to be edited, it has to be played with, it has to be optimized, and you have to build these parts now as an engineer in a different frame of reference. Your mind really has to switch to think of adding things versus subtracting things. That's the challenge. Once all those pieces are in place, in between those two ends, between the vendor, between what the vendor puts out and what the printer reads, once that ecosystem is lined up, then it will be easy. Additive manufacturing, I kind of wanted to just talk about the terminology and some definitions. Embraces a wide variety of materials and processes for creating a wide range of three-dimensional models. What I'm going to do in this presentation is really kind of focus on desktop, the desktop environment. The progress that's being drawn here is that 3D printing is the last piece of direct digital manufacturing. So that means we'll be able to go art to part without, we're letting the computers just hand off the data until the part is made and the part actually resembles the model that you made. The development time, that's a really cool car upstairs. I watched it at IMTS, and I watched it at SEMA being made on the shop floor, and that's that the locomotive's approach is a pretty good template for where I think industry is going to go the next 5 or 10 years. 3D printing invented in '83, and there's been a lot of advances in speed and capabilities. So the ASTM has defined the architecture behind the technology in 7 different silos. So material extrusion is also known as FDM. The machine that's upstairs is an FDM machine. It's a bit of a hybrid because it has that FFF, I think they call it, where they interlace the nylon with Kevlar. So it's a bit of a hybrid combination. The machine next to it is the number 2, the VAT photo machine is stereolithography. So there's all these different technologies that kind of define this field of additive manufacturing. And the way it works is you've got a couple engineers working at Boeing somewhere, and they've come up, these lab scientists have come up with a process or a material that's going to work for their parts. So they invent this material, and then they contact Stratasys or 3D Systems, and they say, okay, build us a machine that will make this work for us. So then Stratasys will come in, build a custom machine around that material and that process, and they'll get like a 2-year run of having exclusive rights to this machine. After 2 years, the exclusivity runs out, and Stratasys is now free to sell that machine to the rest of the world, which means that now what we see is already 2 years old. So there's a lot of processes and machines and developments that are taking place right now that'll keep appearing in all different directions all the time as we roll out. Every time they come out with a new process, then they try to see which VAT or which silo they can call it, what label they can put on it. But the vast majority of the improvements and the technology that are out there right now, we don't know about. They're all proprietary. So I want to talk a little bit about the FDM process. It's an extrusion process. It just takes a reel of filament and then extrudes it. It can be a one nozzle or a 2 nozzle application. It's a sample of a machine below with the 2 reels. They're usually enclosed because this material under FDM is usually some kind of a thermoplastic, and it has heat requirements. So the build plate has to be heated, and the nozzle has to be heated. One of the misconceptions is when you work with this technology is that when you see 2 reels, you can use 2 different materials, and you can't. It's the same material, it's just a different color. Because of the heat requirements, they would have to stop the build, and then reset up the nozzles and the build plates. So what you're seeing right there is a machine that can print 2 colors. One of the interesting, I think, applications here was there's been a lot written now about the space station. The space station has gone out, and they have a 3D printer that runs in a microgravity environment, and something like 60% of the wearable parts in the space station are thermoplastics. They're all little gears and the wheels and the hinges and all those little things that move around that have to be that wear. So those parts have to be replaced. There is not a lot of room for spare parts at the space station, and a resupply mission is months away. So they really have to carry their own spares with them. And the way they do that is when they have a need for a part now, they have mirror machines, and that also run in a microgravity environment here, and they'll go ahead and create a part, and then when the part gets checked out, they'll email them an STL file, and they'll go ahead and print that part over there. So it's a really nice application of FDM technology. The key point there is, as we start to go into deep space exploration, there'll never be a resupply ship. So you're really going to have to carry your spares with you, and what better way to carry them than a roll of filament, and all the possibilities that go with that. So usage, companies. I kind of put a general graph up there. It's done by Wohlers. It's kind of been in not production, but it's been used mostly for prototypes. And right now, about 1/3 of the companies that are out there are using it in an experimental mode. We got a printer, they're kind of flung around somewhere here and there. We're we don't know what we can do with it, but we're just going to see what happens. About a third of the companies out there are actually using it either for a combination of prototyping and moving into making production parts. And a third of the companies out there are, undecided or not interested. It's all going to change. In the next couple of years, we've reached a tipping point right here. In the next couple of years, 50% of the companies are going to be using this thing in a prototype and a production mode, and then 25 will be experimenting, and 25 will be trying to figure out when do I start to get involved. And it's interesting too when people are asked about what are the qualities that you look for in this out of this technology, 37% talked about quality being the primary reason. 28% talked about price, and 10% were concerned about the speed, how long it took to do something. So just a couple words on additive and subtractive manufacturing. In this example, you start off with a virtual model on the left, on the top. You put it on a plate, which is a build plate, which is nothing on it. And then you start depositing material on that plate one layer at a time. So you move across in X and Y, and then you offset it in Z, and then you do another layer and another layer and another layer. At the end of your production one, what you're left with is the physical part, maybe some powder. In the subtractive process, you start off with a virtual model, and then you go ahead and that model is enclosed in a billet of metal or plastic or something, and then you machine that out. You get your finished part, and you have a pile of chips on the floor. So one is the reverse of the other. How do you decide when to use what process? Well, in very general terms, if your product features are small, organic, by organic I mean these really beautiful mesh shapes that look so great in the CAD model when they're shaded and flipped around that you can never manufacture. Those are really good candidates for 3D printing. If they're large drill holes, then you should just go ahead and use a drill on them. Hybrid approach there is to use additive to make those shapes, and then just put it in a subtractive process, and then drill your holes there. So you kind of start to mix and match the two. But you have to know when and how to do that. Materials, if it's sort of in the world of thermoplastics, resins, additive works well. When you're starting to work with metals, it gets pretty complicated, pretty expensive real fast, and unless you're a real high-end aerospace, titanium kind of company, then you should probably stay with the subtractive methods. Units, if it's an iterative process, if you're making small lots, additive. If you're making large production runs, make a mold and crank them out. I kind of like this chart. I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, but basically you have to start applying traditional value engineering criteria, because when this works from a financial point of view, depends on the stage that you're at in the life cycle of the part. With 3D printing, there are no economies of scale. The 100th part will cost as much as the first part. So you're really not, which is kind of, for us that have lived in this world of economies of scale, that's like, whoa, wait a minute, what do you mean? But the opportunity is in the life cycle of a part. When you're first prototyping, you do additive. When you start to get into the manufacturing process, then you start to move into hard metal molds, and you crank out 100,000 parts. And then on the tail end of that, as you get into your spare parts or parts that are getting out of date, then you go back to the additive process. So you can really make it all work for you as long as you have a good spreadsheet and a good handle on your finances. I like the quote I read that 3DP is the model is a lot size of one. So think of 3D printing as the best lot size for a 3D printer is one part. However, that one part can be a custom part. So you can now, even on the same build plate, build 6 parts, and there are 6 variations, custom variations of one part, and all of a sudden you're in the business of customizing parts, and it costs you no more than if you made the one. Here's some examples. So what you get is some design flexibility. You can go ahead and, like the example on the left, you can build conceptual models, and you can do some functional testing. Now in the functional testing, I don't think I'd be putting that piston in a motor when it's made out of plastic, but I can at least put it on the table. I can use it as a communication tool. I can work with my suppliers. I can work with, I can put it together as an assembly to see if anything I forgot, anything I'm missing, is there anything that's not going to work. I can catch that early in the design cycle. With the example in the middle, for instance, it might take me hundreds of thousands of dollars in investments to make the tooling to produce one of these parts, for me to sample it, to give it to my suppliers or my marketing people to give to their consumers, to say, is this the design, I'm BMW, is this the design that I want? In that same time frame, I could have built 3 if I use additive manufacturing. I could have built 3 variations of that at the same time, not spend any money at all on tooling, and then I would present them with 3 solutions, then they could pick the one. So what I've gotten is some design flexibility, and I've gotten the ability to make some better, more intelligent choices and build better products. So how you adopt and integrate that, it's not real obvious. It applies to your particular business, your product portfolio, your supply chain, and your business model. All these things work together to determine if this technology is for you or not. Here's an example, I think a good example of a validation prototype, where you can make the pieces and you can decide, okay, maybe the bottom is good, maybe the handle should be a little bit lifted to the left, or maybe this, I can do some volume calculations, I can see how much will fit into this part. I make it in pieces, I assemble it, I test it, and then I know that I go to production tooling. What it does, it shortens my development life cycle and saves me time. So the printers themselves, this chart represents unit sales, not revenue. But in terms of unit sales, half the units that are out there were made by Stratasys. The next big player is 3D Systems. The other ones are smaller, not because they're not popular, but because they're special application machines. Some of these machines cost millions of dollars. They only make 2 of them, but they'll show up on the chart. It also doesn't account for any unit sales that are less than $5,000. That's why I set it up this way, to where the dominant players are Stratasys, who have acquired MakerBot, and 3D Systems, the others, and there's over 250 of them, I think, in the Wohlers report now. They're all the ones that you see coming out all the time, and they're mostly in that sub $5,000 range. So, and they just keep coming out. They're Kickstarter projects. There's there's stuff made in all over Asia, and they're just everywhere. Most of them are under $5,000, and most of them are geared towards the education and hobby businesses. As an example, here's a Stratasys product suite, pretty clear, all the way from a very small build plate to an engineering desktop application, then all the way up and up and up and up to that, to production machines. Main categories of segmentation for this industry: the prosumer market. That's the machine I have that I use for some of my prototyping work is the Airwolf machine. It's an FDM machine, worked great, cost me $3,500. Remember also that in the cost of a machine, the cost of materials will start to creep ahead of the cost of the machine very quickly. So be aware of that as well. Next category up is the desktop machines, and that gets into the professional level. At that point, you're paying. I think the the machine, the larger one, the 3DS machine there, I believe is about $20,000. So those are your price points. And then you start to move to professional machines. They start to get up about $50,000, and those machines now get pushed out to the shop floor. And those are the ones that do really beautiful resolution in color for you. As you start to move up, then you have the production machines, where you have kind of a factory, a farm, and those are in the 50,000 plus range. Then you get to the hybrid machines, and one of my neighbors runs a company that sells hybrid machines, and his customers are Nike and Apple for their prototyping needs. Those machines run over $1 million each, and they have rows of them at Nike. So the agenda for today is to just talk about what works at the engineering desktop level. And the point is there's actually two agendas here. One is to introduce you to technology, and the other one is to encourage you to start getting the skills that it takes to design products that are optimized for 3D printing. It doesn't start at the machine, and it doesn't start the software that feeds the machine. You have to start looking at your SE models from the point of view of optimization for 3D printing. That's a very special skill set, and that I think is going to be critical both in your personal development and in the development of your company's products. Some choices there: MakerBot, 3D Systems, Stratasys, and many others. I like that MakerBot. It's the one with the 18. It's got an 18-inch travel in Z, which means it'll take 18 hours to finish a part. But beyond that, it's nice to have that extra range. I think depending on the industry, build size becomes really critical. Now, build size, the plate has never really been an issue for us because we teach people how to do that. So in our world, we scale things to fit our build plate. With a scale model, you still get the same interaction. You still teach the same skill set, but you're not so much worried about the part fitting or not. If your part exceeds your build size, the most common thing to do is to build it in pieces. You just build it in sections and you assemble it. What you need to do to get good at that is you need to get really good in the world of post-processing that. And post-processing in the world of 3D printing means gluing it back together again. So what you would do on the model side is you would, add some tabs or something to locate things to make them fit well, and you would use materials that would bond really well to each other. So again, some considerations at the design level, but you just build your part up because it's a communication tool, it's a prototyping tool. You could do that in production, but you sure could work the kinks out of the part before you go to production tooling. By the way, 80% of prototyping, engineering desktop printers, prototyping is done on FDM machines. The other 20% is stereolithography. Those are the two dominant technologies at the desktop level and used in prototyping. Here's an example. One of our customers is Dynatrac. So Dynatrac and Navistar are developing a vehicle. Sorry, I only have one brochure. It's an armored vehicle. Now, what they're doing, what's different about it, is that it's a stealth vehicle for the Special Forces, which has an armored vehicle that looks like a Toyota pickup truck. So when you look at, the video feeds and what's going on in the world, there's an awful lot of bad guys driving Toyota pickup trucks with machine guns on the back. So the Special Forces drive white Toyota trucks. And Dynatrac is partnering with Navistar, and this is their brand. You can see the paddles here come in different colors. So, one day it's white, coming back the other way it's blue. So the whole point is, and I was fortunate enough, I went visit the facility and I got to sit inside one of these things. You can barely open the doors because it's all thick glass and armored plates and everything in it. But in putting this together, they had a 2-week window where they had to send them out for testing, and they were sending out 2 trucks. And Dynatrac makes the axles for them, the 4-wheel drive axles, and they're kind of bulletproof. I mean, they're made out of chrome and heavy material, and they're very heavy duty. So somebody happened to mention that, where's the hubcaps? And hubcaps. In the local Toyota dealership, the hubcaps were $170. However, because of the new inside of the drive shaft, the standard hubcaps didn't fit anymore. So they had about 2 weeks to come up with 6 plastic hubcaps that looked exactly like the Toyota standard caps you'd buy at your local dealership, but the insides were all custom made. So they had a young engineer. He had been 2 years out of UCI, who had used a 3D printer. He said, "Hey, let's just 3D print them." So that's how I got involved in that. We printed them, and they said, "Well, we want to change a few things," and the fit was good. And then the engineer Christian printed the most, jumped on Solid Edge and printed the most beautiful model. And peeled off the STL file, and it was just beautiful. It was contoured, and it was absolutely a beautiful replica. It had nice flared edges. Could never print it. And I said, Christian, you can't have sharp tapered edges coming together for a 3D printer. It just isn't going to hold up. The walls aren't going to hold up. So he came back and he sent another model, and I just threw it on the machine. And then I realized that the edges were still sharp. Christian said, no, they're not sharp. I have a 0.2 of a thousand radius on them. It was a learning moment, right? It was an opportunity for me to teach him that 2/10,000ths is not much of a radius, and the machine is about 1/30th the accuracy of that. But I printed the model, and I handed it to him, and he went, "Oh, that's really pretty. I can print it." But as soon as he touched it, as he passed it to his boss, the thing broke in half. Because the thin walls, the sharp edges, when you do the builds on Z, it doesn't hold together. So, we came back and worked it again, and put some ribs in, and flattened it out, and put a real radius in place, print them up, and then the parts were done. And I think when they went out for quote, they couldn't afford to make a mold, but when they went out to quote them, quotes were almost $800 per cap. We did it for $15 worth of materials. Built 6 of them in a couple days, and off they went on. So, the next series of white Toyota trucks that are on the street right now, back somewhere in Asia Pacific, are going to be running our hubcaps. So, some companies like 3D Systems, Stratasys, Autodesk are all creating their own 3D printing ecosystem. They've realized that it's not plug and play. This is not something that you push a button, and out pops a part. So they're all out there trying to figure out how to put all the pieces in place to try to automate or kind of batch process what happens to that STL file before it hits the printer. So everybody's going off in their own direction. What's going to happen over the next few years is there's going to be a convergence of software, hardware, materials, and services. That's that ecosystem. Autodesk, by the way, just purchased NetFab, which is a company that does STL analysis. So everybody's kind of moving in that direction about trying to make this thing easier and easier and easier. At this case, this example I'm going to talk about, here's all the software apps that you need to crank out a part, to 3D print a part. You start off with Solid Edge as your model. You roll it into a package called NetFab that does your test and repair. Then you have to preview the part. I use Matter Control for that. That shows you all the different layers it has to cut. And then I actually slice the part and output the G-code using a product called Cura. There's a lot of pressure. We talked about it earlier. I was talking to Solid Edge, to John and some of the guys. There's a lot of pressure on CAD companies right now to embed the 3D design features. But some of these niche players now are kind of getting rolled up into the CAD modeling world because there still isn't a clear, distinct separation of who does what. Once you create a CAD model, and once you send out the STL file towards the printer, the connection between the two is broken. Any changes you make to the STL file as it goes downstream is never reflected back into your model. So what you have is a perfect virtual model and an imperfect physical part, and the model never knows that. So there's the things that you can do on the front end and the things that you do in the middle aren't so obvious. So here's the workflow. The first phase, the first thing that you do is you select your materials, and then you have to obtain your model. Then you have to test it, repair it, preview it, slice it, print it, and then post-process it, which means clean it up, glue it, paint it, polish it, sand it, whatever it takes to make it look real. By the way, there's these skill sets are all very discrete. I was looking at Price Waterhouse report, and 35% of all the ads posted for engineering jobs in the last 30 days required some kind of 3D printing skill set. So the industry is aware that the skill set is very much needed. So as an engineer, I'd highly recommend that you start moving into this industry and understanding the terminology and getting some hands-on experience. And it's not just the industrial mechanical engineers, it's also the software developers, application guys, designers for commercial industrial products, marketing managers. There's going to be a really high demand for marketing and selling expertise as the software that drives this industry and the applications that drive it are going to want people that understand it in more and more quantity. So in the workflow, the first thing you got to do is you have to select the material. You develop a profile based on how the part's going to look, the geometry, the function, life cycle, certification. I have this diff plate here in the bag. If somebody want to take a look at that afterwards. But again, this is not the part. This is a shaded STL version of the part. This is not the CAD model. We've already peeled this off the CAD model and are now looking at it, visualizing it in this manner. Material groupings are generally grouped as plastic. Plastic and non-plastic is kind of how it goes, plastics and metals. Within the plastic world, FDM, there's a pretty large range of thermoplastics. The key thing here is if you take the material properties of ABS and you take that and when it comes as grains and you package it and you put it through a molding process, you heat it, you punch it out, it falls out and it cools. The ABS that's created, that part, is different from a part where you take the same raw material but you layer it in a 3D printing process, because what you do then is you just bond one layer to the other. That does not have the same properties as the molded part. That has some inherent weaknesses built into it, especially in the z-axis, because that's where the bond is. So in the design process, the orientation of your part is critical. You want to orientate it to where you need the strength. So you flip and turn the part around to get that to work correctly. And you still not the same properties. So just be cautious of. You have to learn. That's one of the skills you learn. You have to learn when you start moving into this world. You have to learn more about materials. I like to use PLA. It's a good prototype material. It's friendly. It's used in medical applications, packaging, tableware, hygiene products, and it comes in lots of colors. Methods: you obtain a model. You can obtain that by 3 different ways. You can create a solid model with solid edge. You can import an STL file, an existing STL file, or you can scan a part and import the STL or the point cloud. Here this slide with this is the solid edge, the SC screen for exporting the STL file. So STL is the link between the virtual and the physical world. This is a NetFab capture, and NetFab tests and repairs. It checks the files for manifold issues, make sure the part is a true solid. It previews the parts, how they fit within the build chamber, automatically creates support structures. As your angle of the part changes, the printer can't print in space, so it needs supports. So the software determines the angles that come across the surface, and when it gets to be over 60 degrees, it grows a support structure from the build plate. And then afterwards, part of the fixing of the part is to cut those support structures away. And there's lots of ways of doing that. And then it does the slices, and it generates the G-code. Here's the test repair. This is under NetFab. This is how the part's imported. That's what the mesh looks like. And then we start nesting and rotating that part. Once the software checks and make sure that the triangles that define the STL part are correct. And by correct, the triangles have to meet at all boundaries, and the vectors that define those triangles have to be pointing in the same direction. That makes a part manifold, makes it a valid solid model. What looks like a valid solid model in a CAD program may not be that at all, depending on how you build it. So this product is very important because it repairs the parts. Afterwards, after we preview it, we upload it, then we position it on the print bed, and then we generate the G-code. So here's the part that's being created. This is how it prints on the machine, and you can see that the flat part of the part, the thing that's happening in the middle, that's a support structure being grown to meet the part. So when it gets to that critical angle, it's the extrusion head is supported, and that finishes the part. Here it is being built. Also notice that the shell, the green, is a shell, and there's a thickness to that shell, and that's the part that you're looking at. The internal workings of that part is that grid. So the grid, the part is not filled solid. You can determine or define how much of that you want to be set up as a grid versus what percentage you want it to be filled. This is why the aerospace guys love this, because you get the same strength out of this material with all that material being taken away. So you get lightness with strength. It's one of the huge advantages of 3D printing. In the workflow, this is the print cycle itself. When the machine first starts, it lays a bead around there to get the flow going right, and then it starts to actually start to lay the material down for making the part. This is a cloud-based application. This is their dashboard, and it's hooked up to the printer. You can upload your part after you've validated it, and then you can tell where it is in the print process and the temperatures. And the cool part is when the part's done, it emails you and tells you that your part's done on your phone. It also captures the images in sequence, and it downloads it to YouTube. So I can go, I got an email, my part's done, I go to YouTube and I watch it being built up. Here's the physical part. Now what Jim did is, this is the part in that little cart up front, which sure looks like a metal part, but it's not, it's plastic. He just did that to take to a show. This is, I believe, SEMA last year. He took that to the show and just demonstrate, how viable is the part? Do I have customers for it? People look around, touch it, had no clue it was plastic. And he, cost them maybe $25 to make that part. Another example is GE First Built. They're a very innovative company business collaboration, and they have a printer attached to every design group. You don't need a printer for every workstation, but you need one, probably every four or five stations, just so everyone has access and everyone gets the hands-on experience. Getting started, I just wanted to do some words about, don't wait for perfection, don't wait for enterprise ready. Start taking the baby steps right now if you haven't already. There's a new skill set now too called, there's going to be a major that you can take in college called an additive manufacturing engineer. And that's a combination. It's not a manufacturing person, it's a design engineer that knows the additive, that has a new skill set. DFM, Design for Manufacturing rules, still apply, but they've changed. Okay. Design for manufacturing used to be for subtractive manufacturing. Now you're looking at DFM for additive manufacturing. What you want to do is have both skill sets, because this is something that you can trade back and forth. That talent, acquiring that talent, that's only a part of a strategy. What you need is a roadmap. What you need to do, and I have an adoption roadmap. You need to take a look and see, okay, what am I gonna measure? I want to make sure that all of my designers are actually working with this technology. How are our engineers, once they've gone through the program? So with an adoption map, your ROIs, kind of haphazard. With a structured adoption program, you can get some really excellent results. So you're measuring how our engineers are using the printers and what's the real value that they're adding to my product line. Investment, I want to just throw some numbers out there. For a desktop engineering investment, you should be somewhere between $10,000 and $25,000. That includes the training component, the software that you need for all the validation in between, and the 3D printer. So it's pretty reasonable, it's pretty reachable, it's within the budget of most engineering companies. So let's go back a slide. What the adoption process consists of is instructor-led training. You need to have your engineer, designers, and operators be taught by an instructor using job-related exercises. You want to be working on your parts. You also need some online training that's a refresher for those skills that you didn't catch during the training event. And then you need some measurement and follow-up to close the loop in the adoption process. That's the path. And I would recommend a map for each company, each division. So the project that we did was the trophies be thrown upstairs. And this is just the process we followed. I was given a model out of SC on last year's trophies. I took that model and I imported the file from the SC model, cut it into 3 different sections, cut it apart, and took the base, analyzed the base, repaired it, duplicated it on the build plate, took it up to the cloud, turned on the machine, put in the model in 3 different pieces or 4 pieces, and then crazy glued it together. So when I delivered the models here, it comes with a little tube of crazy glue, which is the official repair kit. None of it's was hand done. This was just done in different colors of material. None of it was hand painted or anything. I can barely glue things together, much less paint them. So here is the workflow. You go from a virtual model, CAD model, you go into the test repair mode, you preview it, and you can see how it's being cut and sliced. You slice it, print a machine, and there's your physical model. That's the workflow. That was an image of the trophies from last year, and then the one on the right is the result for this year. 3DP is a disruptive technology, and it comes from the fact that you can merge the virtual and the physical world. And it's my favorite slide. I don't know if I believe it or not, but I think that that this technology is somewhere on that tipping point. We're probably just a little bit to the left of the early majority, but I think in the next 2 years we're going to start riding down that slope of the late majority, or the laggards. And I think that adopters have a bit of advantage. And I'm not saying you should go out and buy $1 million machine, but I think spending 20 grand to invest in this skill set, to learning and moving in this direction, is going to be a very, very good investment, and is going to result in better employees and better products. Any questions? Thank you. I've got some parts. I'll be upstairs if you want to talk and get together. Glad to meet with you.